say dinosaurs turned to birds. There are very few ideas as dumb as this one. The Bible says God made the birds on day 5. He made the reptiles on day 6.
Yeah, well, I know another book that says that extraterrestrial mice, working in conjunction with an eccentric artist named Slarty Bartfast, created the Earth with the intent that it be used as a supercomputer, until a spaceship full of idiots crashed down on the planet and ruined its programming. But it doesn't really matter what our storybooks say. It only matters what the facts are. And the evidence says evolution.
Evolution says reptiles came first and then the birds.
Worse, it turns out that birds actually are reptiles. Unless you go by the old definition of reptile from the 19th century, in which case birds are not reptiles, but then neither are dinosaurs.
You know, everything about evolution is backwards to the Bible. Everything.
One application of the term backward is to imply that something or someone may be out of time, as in backward in time, being old-fashioned or regressive. For example, biblical authors were still writing passages implying that the earth must be flat, long after science-minded scholars knew better. So it's no surprise that the Bible got the order of things wrong, too.
But this article says, dinosaurs alive as birds, scientist says. Ooh, wow, scientist says. Well, that proves it right there. Just like it gives some kind of authority. Wow, scientist says.
Well, of course, we should expect experts to know the most about this, right? I mean, that's what makes them experts, isn't it? And why is it that every ignorant idiot thinks they know more about things they've never studied than all the world's best educated expert specialists anywhere ever?
This is absurd. Everything about the bird evolution is baloney.
No, birds really did evolve from dinosaurs, and there's still dinosaurs right now. Just like lions are still cats, and iguanas are still lizards, and people are still apes. That's not baloney. That's a verifiable fact.
Okay. Archaeoraptor was listed in 1999 as the missing link. Yes, boys and girls, breaking news, National Geographic, we found the missing link. They had a whole big article about the missing link has been discovered. Then a couple months later, oops, it was proven wrong.
Actually, it was already disproved even before National Geographic bought the story, and it is an interesting story. Some farmers in China had 2 lithographic fossils, neither of which they thought would be very valuable alone. One was of a Cretaceous bird, and it had a sort of stumpy tail that you'd expect a bird to have, since long-tailed birds went the way of the dodo back in the Jurassic. The other fossil was a long tail from an as yet unidentified feathered dromaeosaur, albeit a really small one. So they fitted and glued the tail onto the bird to make one fossil that they could get more money for, and they did. They sold it to some guy for $80,000. And the fool who bought it, that fraudulent forgery, illegally, and smuggled it back home, was not a scientist. He was an artist, a paleo artist. Stephen Zirkus made beautifully lifelike sculptures of dinosaurs, so of course he was the one that made this depiction of Archaeoraptor, though this is far from his best work. Years earlier, when they showed his art at the Dallas Museum of Natural History around Y2K, I was very impressed with it. I got their number and I spoke to his wife on the phone, praising them for what lovely work they do. But Stephen was not a scientist, and he was not a skeptic either. I was on a road trip that routed through Blanding, Utah, that I deliberately charted that way just so that I could visit his museum, and I called him to tell him that I'm coming and that I'd like to meet him. But he didn't want to meet me, and I didn't know why. So when I got there, he was gone. I took friends and family through his museum, and we admired his work. And then I saw one wall where he had a dendrogram, or a phylogenetic tree, like this one, except that his was largely or partially upside down, as if dinosaurs, or at least some dinosaurs, had evolved from birds instead of the other way around. And that's what I realized why he didn't even want to talk to me. He belonged to a small association called BAND, Birds Are Not Dinosaurs. And this small group, formed by paleontologists John Rubin and Alan Feducia back in the 1980s, swore a pact that they would deny and reject and argue against any and all evidence that might ever arise that birds descend from dinosaurs. And they made this wholly dishonest covenant back when there was as yet little evidence of that. It had just started coming in. So Zirkus was the type who apparently liked to believe things that are not evidently true. And he showed his prized possession to a half-dozen scientists, all of whom warned him that these things don't go together, that it's a composite fossil, 2 different animals, not what you think it is. Every scientist who looked at it said, this ain't right. But Zirkus had just paid 80 grand for this black market forgery. So think of the sunk cost fallacy. He couldn't admit that he was duped by so much for nothing. Still refusing to accept that he paid 80 grand for a worthless forgery, Zirkus tried to convince himself and others that it was real. And he pushed to have it published in the National Geographic, which is a popular magazine for regular people in the mainstream. It is not a scientific journal. Because it's not a scientific journal, National Geo, or Nat Geo, tried to submit a paper elsewhere to get peer review so that they could do a press conference with all the desired fanfare. However, the leading journals, Nature and Science, both rejected their paper on the grounds that the fossil had been illegally smuggled and that it had obviously been tampered with to increase its value. Still undaunted, even after all of that, National Geographic foolishly ran the story anyway, convinced that the fossil would be peer-reviewed eventually, even after it had already been rejected by everyone who knew anything about it.
You know, everything about these feathered dinosaurs has been proven baloney. But guess what? They're still teaching it.
Because feathered dinosaurs, the idea that dinosaurs had feathers, was never disproved. Archaeoraptor was a composite of two fossils. One, a Cretaceous bird that was already known and not particularly interesting. The other fossil, however, was the long tail of a small feathered dromaeosaur. Because we now know that a whole lot of theropod dinosaurs, including nearly all of the dromaeosaurs, had feathers. That means velociraptors, oviraptors, deinonychus, dakotaraptors, and all those things had tiny wings that could be used in sexual displays, but they were also really efficient to help incubate a larger clutch of eggs, as we see demonstrated in this oviraptor fossil sitting on its nest. Without the insulation provided by small wings, it would be impossible for this animal to keep these eggs warm.
Here's a whole book, The Feathered Dinosaurs of China. Well, you just got this recently? Why would they still be teaching something that's been proven wrong for 5 years?
Because feathered dinosaurs were not disproved. The composite fossil known as Archaeoraptor was disproved, that it was made of two different animals, one of them being a feathered dinosaur from China. The tail part of the Archaeoraptor composite turned out to be something special and significant. Because it was so small, it was named Microraptor. But that's really the wrong name, because when they named it, they didn't yet know what it was or what it could do. It turned out that Microraptor is a precursor to Archaeopteryx. It's a non-avian dinosaur, like a tiny velociraptor, that is so very bird-like that creationists commonly say that it's a bird. Not because of the bones, because the skeleton is that of a dinosaur, no question. But they all had feathers. And some people think that only superficial surface features are definitive, as if every dinosaur with feathers is a bird. There were also things like Rahone avis, that is literally a velociraptor that is small enough and has wings big enough to fly, a flying velociraptor. But Microraptor is a precursor to these in the sense that it couldn't yet fly, but it could glide if it extended all four wings.
All this feathered dinosaur stuff is baloney. It's all baloney.
This preacher says that a lot, 4 times in this one video. But what does it mean? Astronomer Carl Sagan, the scientist and science teacher who turned me on to rational skepticism, gave us what he called a baloney detector kit. Now, as I go through the list of what that includes, I want you to think about the arguments and evidence that I have presented in this series from peer-reviewed scientific literature and compare that to the unsupported and factually false assertions, assumptions, and mind quotations that the preacher's been spewing all through this seminar. If the truth matters to me, and you don't want to be deceived into believing something that isn't true, and you want to know if somebody is feeding you a load of baloney, then, whenever possible, there must be independent confirmation of the facts. Beyond that, you should encourage substantive debate on the evidence by knowledgeable proponents of all points of view. Arguments from authority carry little weight. Authorities have made mistakes in the past. They will do so again in the future. Perhaps a better way to say it is that in science there are no authorities. At most, there are experts. And these expert scientists, by the way, don't sit around making up silly stories and unsupported assertions and distortions of evolution like this preacher saying that there has to be an unusable stage of half wings and half legs for evolution to be true. Scientists don't go asking any old rando for their uneducated opinion like this preacher who says that scientists say we came from rocks, even though no scientist ever said that. There's a lot more research that is peer-reviewed for factual errors that can possibly fit into a flippant one-liner. So they don't ask Joe Blow for a correction, nor do they encourage belief either. The scientists challenge each other's hypotheses, and whatever isn't supported doesn't warrant serious consideration. Spin more than one hypothesis. If there's something to be explained, think of all the different ways in which that could be explained. Then think of tests which might systematically disprove each of those alternatives. What survives, the hypothesis that resists disproof in this Darwinian selection among multiple working hypotheses, has a much better chance of being the right answer than if you had simply run with the first idea that caught your fancy. Try not to get overly attached to a hypothesis just because it's yours. It's only a way station in the pursuit of knowledge. Ask yourself why you like the idea. Compare it fairly with the alternatives to see if you can find reasons for rejecting it. If you don't, others will. And this is a problem that affects jury trials. Retrospective studies show that some jurors make up their minds very early, perhaps during opening arguments, and then retain the evidence that seems to support their initial impression while rejecting all the contrary evidence. And the method of comparing and analyzing alternative working hypotheses is not working in their heads. Quantify if whatever it is that you're explaining has some measure, some numeric quantity attached to it. You'll be much better able to discriminate among competing hypotheses. What is vague and qualitative is open to many explanations. Of course, there are truths to be sought in the many qualitative issues we are obliged to confront, but finding them is more challenging. If there's a chain of argument, every link in the chain must work, including the premise, not just most of them. Occam's razor. This convenient rule of thumb urges us, when faced with two hypotheses that explain the data equally well, to choose the simpler. I would also add that we can employ Hitchens' razor as well, that while positive claims require positive evidence, just as Sagan said, Hitchens added that what is asserted without evidence may be dismissed without evidence. And finally, always ask whether the hypothesis can be, at least in principle, falsified. Because there should be some way to tell if it's wrong, if it is, right? You'd want to know that, right? I mean, why would you want to believe something that might not even be true? Only accurate information has practical application. So if a proposition cannot be indicated or vindicated, verified or falsified, such that there's no way to know whether it's right or wrong or what's wrong with it and which direction would lead to correction, then it's worthless. The only value information can have is however accurate it can be shown to be. And if you can't show that it's accurate at all, then it has no value at all. And it's not only empty speculation, but pointless as well. And that's the problem with every religious sermon I've ever heard.
We covered more on that in one of the debates I did. I forget which one, but...
I know we covered this back when the preacher debated me.
And then you said, it is a fact that birds are a subset of dinosaurs. Obviously, this is similar to a bird. Who can't see the difference?
One problem with creationists is your perspective has no depth. Let me explain this to you one last time. It's really not that hard. Remembering that evolution is all about biodiversity. The Phylogeny Explorer has logged some 1,440 dinosaur species. There are a few subclades within the dinosaur clade, one of them being sauropods, like the toy you were just showing. Another being theropods, which are bipedal, like birds. And it was along this lineage that traces of pycnofibers developed into downy feathers and eventually double-veined feathers like modern birds have. And what we see of their evolutionary development in the fossil record matches their embryological development in modern birds. As we examine each of the species in this lineage, we see a definite series of transitions to increasingly bird-like dinosaurs until they are indistinguishable from birds, until the dinosaurs become birds. But none of these birds ever stopped being dinosaurs.
There's an article about this, DarwinismRefuted.com. I don't know anything about them, but I enjoyed what I read. Are birds and dinosaurs related? They go through a whole list of things showing no, they cannot possibly be related for all sorts of reasons. Their heart is completely different. Their lung structure completely different. Their reproductive, no, reptiles and birds have a hard calcium-covered egg shell. Reptiles have a leathery type of egg. How did it go in the difference there?
The reptile family tree has a deep fork between two main branches. The only reptiles to have a leathery shell are lizards and snakes, which are a subset of lizards. And they're on the lepidosauur side of the reptile family tree. And they have three-chambered hearts. Turtles are older and more toward the middle of the fork, between lepidosaurs and archosaurs. They have 3.5-chambered hearts, as well as hard-shelled eggs. Dinosaurs, crocodilians, and birds are all in the archosaur side of the reptile family tree, and they all have hard calcium-covered eggs and 4-chambered hearts. Dinosaurs and birds are both warm-blooded and covered in feathers. They have the same type egg, the same type heart, and the same type of respiration. Dinosaurs and birds share a unique system of air sacs connected to hollow pneumatic skeletons that some of them could actually breathe through. And this extremely efficient system allows for a continuous flow of oxygen rather than the hepatic piston method of breathing that crocodiles use. There is no more diagnostic feature than this unique system of air sacs that birds obviously inherited from dinosaurs. Remember when you thought that lizards grew up to be dinosaurs, even though they're cold-blooded, naked, and only have 3-chambered hearts? Are you embarrassed by that yet?
No, reptiles have a separate passage for the baby to be born from the urinary tract, where birds have all one. Just one hole does it all for a bird. That's where they go number 1, number 2, and have babies, all same place. Go check it out. How did it change, make that transition between that one and the other?
Birds are technically reptiles, and as such they use the same cloaca as all other reptiles do, and monotremes too. The only animals with separated anus, vagina, and urinary tract are mammals of the clade Theria. All other fossil mammals apparently had a cloaca too, just like the platypus and echidna still do.
No, whales have a separate hole for breathing than eating, and they can eat and breathe at the same time. They're not connected. From that hole in the top of their head goes to their lungs, and the hole in their mouth goes to their stomach. Birds have one hole in their mouth that have to breathe through and eat through, so how did it make the connection and separate the lungs from the stomach, the esophagus? I mean, explain this with some real science, please.
If we're comparing birds and dinosaurs, then why did you bring up whales? As if the esophagus of birds evolved from that of whales, or vice versa? What is the connection that you imagine here? Did you think that whales are dinosaurs, just like you thought that lizards are dinosaurs? Whales are placental mammals, like we are. We have a secondary palate dividing our mouth from our nasal passage. This trait first started growing in Permian therapsids and was completed in proto-mammalian cynodont fossils long before there were any dinosaurs. But birds, being reptiles, and cynodonts, being on their way to becoming mammals, had already split a long time earlier than that. Mammals and reptiles both belong to the clade Amniota because our young are born in an amnion. Amniota had 2 daughter clades. Synapsids are where the mammals are, and diapsids are where the reptiles are, and we've been separate ever since.
They say birds are descendants of dinosaurs. Well, kids, in case you don't know, there are a few differences between a dinosaur and a bird. Okay, you don't just put a few feathers on them and say, come on, man, give it a try. It won't hurt too bad. It's just not that easy.
Notice how the preacher shows a sauropod as if that's what birds came from. He's looking for the most extreme thing he can show you to try to make this look ridiculous. That's why he didn't stop on the previous slide he had just showed, the one with all the feathered dinosaurs that already had small wings, the ones that are already almost birds. Because we don't put feathers on dinosaurs, we find feathers on dinosaurs. And we found feathers on an awful lot of them. Things like therizinosaurs that could never be confused with birds. We now know that even tyrannosaurs had feathers. Now, some ceratopsians had something like feathers as well, though it's a different kind of plumage because they're not theropods, they're outside of that. And the feather types are not always the double-veined flight feather either. We found more primitive feather types on more primitive coelurosaurs like Sinosauropteryx and Sinonithosaurus and so on, so that many of them had down like a baby duck. Then we have a parallel of evolutionary development reflected in the biological development of feathers in embryo. Feathers first appear as tiny spikes, which then erupt into hair-like follicles or divided fronds, which we call downy feathers. They develop further, and then downy feathers fuse into a rachis. And this is what we think that some ceratopsians had. There's evidence that it's something like a rachis instead of actual plumage. And some paleognathe feathers consist of a rachis with downy feathers streaming off of it, but they aren't organized. Neognathes also have barbules zippering these fronds into a vein, and flight feathers are the most adapted to being asymmetrical. Each of these stages of feather development in embryo is seen duplicated in the appropriate geological sequence of fossils, so that some dinosaurs looked spiky or hairy, and some were fluffy or downy, and some only had a rachis, and so on. The result is that what you see in Jurassic Park wouldn't look nearly as dangerous as they really would be.
See, reptiles have 4 perfectly good legs. Birds have 2 legs and 2 wings. So if his front legs are going to change to wings, somewhere along the line they're going to be half leg and half wing. Which means on that particular day he can't run anymore and he still can't fly yet, so he's got a real problem. Serious problem.
Notice how the preacher thinks that one individual animal is evolving over one lifetime as opposed to whole populations over many generations, such that the preacher imagines that there would be one particular day when this one individual couldn't run anymore, as if flying birds can't also run. More importantly, the preacher thinks that velociraptors can't run. They're actually quite fast and capable, and they're exactly the animal he's describing now. But far from having the serious problem of being unable to move or function efficiently, some Maniraptoran dinosaurs actually lived up to the hype from the movies. And part of that flapping motion that birds have comes from their ancestors springing forth their folded arm claws like a trap. That's why they're called Maniraptors, the grasping hand. And this is why I say that Microraptor was given the wrong name, because someone else had already named this animal, predicting that it would be discovered 100 years before it was. Back in 1915, an ornithologist named William Beebe was studying Archaeopteryx, and he realized that it had feathers on its hind legs. Not just regular downy plumage like other birds have there. Archaeopteryx had flight feathers on its hind legs. Now, either that animal had a divine designer that was a bit inept, or those hind legs were once wings. Archaeopteryx didn't have much of a wingspan. It would have been difficult to fly, but it could just barely do it. So Beebe reasoned that as the wingspan increased from the tiny wings of velociraptors, and before they were as big as Archaeopteryx wings, he thought that it must have evolved through what he called a tetrapteryx stage, where a small dinosaur could jump from a high place and spread eagle and glide on 4 wings. Microraptor is a transitional species that Beebe predicted over a century ago. So by right of priority, Microraptor should be called Tetrapteryx.